The woman known to history as Queen Mary I of England was born on the 18th of February 1516 at Greenwich Palace, just outside London. Mary's father was King Henry VIII of England, the reigning monarch since 1509, and just the second of the Tudor dynasty, which had been established in 1485 by Henry's father, King Henry VII. Her mother was Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII and a daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. The two monarchs, whose marriage in 1469 would eventually bring about the union of Aragon and Castile into the Kingdom of Spain. Mary was the first healthy baby born from Henry and Catherine's marriage, she having suffered multiple stillbirths and miscarriages since they were wed in 1509. The circumstances of Mary's birth and the political events of the years that followed would shape her entire life. Her grandfather, King Henry VII, had seized the throne of England back in 1485 after defeating King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. With hindsight, we can say that this brought the Wars of the Roses, the series of civil wars that had racked England since the 1450s, to an end. During these, the houses of York and Lancaster had vied for the crown after the mental collapse of King Henry VI from the early 1450s onwards created a political crisis. Eventually, Henry Tudor, a Welsh upstart with a quite tenuous claim to the throne, had won out in 1485. Yet several major revolts occurred in the late 1480s and into the 1490s, and there was no guarantee that the Tudor dynasty would not be overthrown in time, just as Henry VI and Richard III had been. This made the task of producing a male heir that would ensure a smooth succession all the greater in the eyes of Mary's father, Henry VIII. While women were not legally disbarred from succeeding to the throne in England, it would still be considered very much a last resort for Mary to become queen one day. Her entire early life would be shaped by her father's quest to acquire a male heir. When Mary was born in 1516, Catherine was only 30 and Henry was in his mid-20s. The assumption was that a male heir would arrive eventually. Consequently, during her earlier years, the king and his ministers were more concerned about who Mary would marry one day. At the time, England held the balance of power in Western Europe between Spain and France, who were engaged in a long-running conflict for hegemony over the Italian peninsula. The logic of English diplomacy was that Mary would marry either a French or Spanish prince to cement an alliance with one side or the other. She was first betrothed to the Dauphin of France at just 2 years old, an engagement which, like several others made in the ensuing years, was abandoned when alliances shifted once again. At the age of 6, Mary was betrothed to her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was 16 years her senior, in order to cement Henry's alliance with the emperor against the King of France. Just 4 years later, fortunes would shift once again when Charles married Isabella of Portugal instead, an act which enraged Henry. Mary would have been blissfully unaware of these diplomatic negotiations during her youth. Catherine herself supervised Mary's early education, providing foundational religious instruction, teaching her daughter to speak French and Spanish as fluently as English, as well as learning Latin, the language of the Roman Catholic Church, and one in which many books were still being produced during the 16th century. Mary was also instructed in music and dance, both of which, like her parents, she showed a talent for. At 4 years old, she honored a delegation from the King of France with a performance on the virginal, a forerunner of the harpsichord. Catherine's own experience of having a strong mother like Isabella of Castile, a great military commander and queen in her own right, almost certainly influenced her approach to raising and educating her daughter. It is perhaps partly because her mother did not doubt that Mary could be queen that Mary herself acquired the confidence and conviction of her right to succeed to the throne one day. Mary's father also adored his daughter, lavishing frequent gifts on her and referring to her as "my pearl in the world." Mary resembled her father in some respects. She had the same fair complexion, pale blue eyes, and ruddy cheeks. Like him, she also loved music and dancing. When Mary was 9 years old in 1525, her father, still lacking a legitimate son, made her the de facto Princess of Wales, vaguely confirming that she was heir to the throne of England. He sent her to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches to rule Wales in his name and to complete her education. This practice was typical for a king-in-waiting, but some historians emphasize the fact that, while Mary was treated in every other way as the heir to the throne, she was never officially invested with the title of Princess of Wales, which no woman in English history had then ever held in her own right. This lack of formal investiture indicates that Henry did not really intend that Mary should be queen and still planned to have a son. However, the decision to send her to Wales and provide her with her own independent household for the first time indicates that the king was making contingency plans at the same time, should a male heir not arrive. Catherine, after all, was nearly 40 years old by then, and her childbearing years would soon be behind her. Henry, a spendthrift monarch who completely reversed the sound economic footing his father had placed the English state on, spent generously on outfitting Mary's household at Ludlow with everything needed to advertise her position as heir to the throne of England. There was a throne in Mary's presence chamber, where she received ambassadors, dignitaries, and petitioners on her father's behalf in Wales. Cloth of gold covered the altar in Mary's chapel at Ludlow, and a staff of literally dozens served at her court. Yet, historians have noted that Henry spent about the same amount of money annually on the household of his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, born in 1519 to one of his mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, whom the king had also made Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Some, therefore, still consider it an open question as to whether Henry might have been toying in the 1520s and for much of the 1530s with the idea of trying to leave his throne to Richmond despite his illegitimacy. In any event, Richmond died in 1536 of what may have been tuberculosis. What was perhaps especially strange about the concerns about Mary succeeding as Queen of England was that King Henry II, King Edward IV, and Mary's own grandfather, King Henry VII, had all claimed to have inherited a legitimate right to rule from female forebears. Henry VII had simultaneously borrowed his legitimacy from his wife, Elizabeth of York, and his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Most scholars, therefore, assume that Henry VIII, in the absence of a son, intended that his daughter would be queen, but that her power would be exercised primarily by her husband until a male heir of hers came of age, as precedent dictated. Matters changed, though, in the second half of the 1520s after Anne Boleyn, the daughter of a leading English diplomat, Sir Thomas Boleyn, won the king's attentions at court. Increasingly disenchanted with his wife, Henry became infatuated with Anne. For her part, Boleyn played a long game and refused to let Henry enter her bed for a very long time, arguing with the king that she would not enter a relationship with him until he gave serious consideration to obtaining a divorce from Catherine and then marrying her. If he made her Queen of England, Anne assured Henry she would give him the male heir he so longed for to secure the Tudor dynasty. So began what would soon become known both in England and at the courts of Europe as the King's Great Matter, his quest to obtain a divorce from Mary's mother, Catherine. While the Protestant Reformation was already underway across Europe, was sundering the ties between some kingdoms and states with the papacy in Rome, England was still very much within the Roman Catholic fold in the 1520s. If Henry wanted a divorce, he had to provide evidence of a clear legal basis for doing so to Pope Clement VII in Rome. Soon, an annulment to the marriage was being sought on the grounds that Henry's union with Catherine had broken biblical law because she had briefly been married to his older brother Arthur, who had died in 1502. Henry and Catherine had received a papal dispensation to be wed when he became king because Catherine had claimed that the brief marriage to Prince Arthur had never been consummated. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Henry claimed he was having an attack of conscience and needed to divorce Catherine as he had breached the injunction of the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, which stated, "If any man should take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they will be childless." In 1527, Henry secretly made his first overtures concerning the divorce to Pope Clement VII. Unfortunately for Henry, Emperor Charles V's armies had sacked and occupied Rome right around this time. Charles was Queen Catherine's nephew, and there was no way a papal dispensation for Henry to divorce Catherine would be forthcoming from Rome so long as the city was in Spanish hands. In any event, even when the situation in Rome changed in the years that followed, Clement would not prove to be receptive to Henry's overtures for a divorce. Thus, Henry would spend the next several years pursuing his great matter through various legal, academic, and theological arguments. Eventually, he would take the dramatic decision to split with Rome altogether and declare himself to be the supreme head of the Church in England. In this way, he was able to sanction his own divorce from Catherine in 1533 and marry Anne Boleyn almost immediately thereafter. These moves also opened the floodgates for Protestant reformers like the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, to begin introducing wide-ranging religious reforms to England. All of these initiatives had consequences for Mary between 1527 and 1533. In 1528, Henry recalled her from Ludlow to the court. Her recall at this time to London suggests that her father mistakenly anticipated that he would soon acquire his divorce, marry Anne, and produce a son, in which case it would be better to not have Mary at Ludlow performing the duties of a Princess of Wales. Yet, although Henry would have known that his divorce would have the consequence of making Mary legally illegitimate, he did not immediately demote her in any other way. Perhaps this was simply for practicality's sake. After all, Henry could not be certain that he would get his divorce, or that Anne would give birth to a son once they were married. Hence, even as Henry pursued the divorce which would make his daughter illegitimate, she remained Princess Mary, her servants continued to wear her badges, and Henry continued to support her household financially. The ensuing years were painful and humiliating for both Catherine and Mary. Mother and daughter were subjected to tales of Henry's intimacy with Anne at court, and Henry continued to browbeat Catherine for denying that her marriage to Arthur had been consummated, demanding that she agree to dissolve the marriage. Catherine refused, asserting that their marriage was valid and that she was rightly the Queen of England by God's will. In retaliation, Henry forbade her to see or communicate with Mary until she submitted to Henry's will. Cut off from her mother and uncertain of her fate at her father's hands, 15-year-old Mary's health began to suffer. She experienced irregular menstrual patterns and bouts of crippling depression. It is unclear what caused these symptoms. Given her later health issues, which we will return to, these were most likely the first signs of some reproductive health issues. Alternatively, it may have been the general stress of the situation she found herself in as little more than a child of 12 or 13 from the end of the 1520s onwards. Compounding this was Henry's drift towards the small but growing Protestant camp within England, something which both Catherine and Mary, as devout Roman Catholics, found doubly troubling on top of the divorce proceedings. Henry himself was a doctrinal Catholic, but he was an exceptionally impressionable monarch, and as Protestant reformers like Cranmer counselled him on how to obtain his divorce, they also managed to convince him of the reasonableness of some of the new Protestant ideas that were arriving to England from the continent. In January 1531, Henry received a communication from the Pope ordering him to separate from Anne until Rome had made its final decision on the proposed annulment of his first marriage. In response, the king addressed the English Parliament in February and made clear his intentions to be recognized as supreme head of the Church of England. Parliament acquiesced in principle, and Henry's new title was proclaimed, but it would take a year and more to obtain a final submission from England's clergy, and many bishops and leading clerics were removed from their positions when they refused to acknowledge the supremacy. As this played out, Anne had moved into Queen Catherine's chambers and was living as the de facto queen. It cannot be doubted that all of this hurt Mary deeply, both in terms of her familial situation and her religious views. One of the characteristics most often ascribed to Mary Tudor is a remarkable piety and an overly zealous devotion to Catholicism. However, it was not until much later in life that her engagement with religion would increase to the point of becoming especially noteworthy or extreme. It is likely that her long separation from her mother and the pervasiveness of Protestant reform in England's halls of power made her cleave more closely to her Catholicism. On the 25th of January 1533, nigh on 7 years after he had first begun pursuing her, Henry VIII finally married Anne Boleyn in a secret early morning ceremony in his private chapel at Whitehall Palace. She was already pregnant. Events then began to proceed apace, as Henry and the newly created Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, acted to consolidate Henry's control of the Church, to affirm England's separation from Rome, and to finalize his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, who was now banished from court and living at Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, her health declining steeply at the same time. In May of 1533, Cranmer declared the king's first marriage null and void and his marriage to Anne as valid. This supposedly made the now 17-year-old Mary illegitimate, yet Henry did not immediately proceed to declare her as such. In fact, she retained her title and her father's financial support for her household during the ensuing months. On the 1st of June, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England, and on the 7th of September, she gave birth to her and Henry's first child. Much to the king's dismay, it was a girl, whom they named Elizabeth. Henry proclaimed, quote, "By God's grace, boys will follow." Several weeks after Elizabeth's birth, Henry instructed that Mary's title of princess should be revoked, and henceforth she should be referred to as the Lady Mary. Her servants were told to remove her royal badges and to wear only the king's. Sent to live in her new half-sister's household, she was allegedly mistreated there on Anne's orders in the period that ensued, though the veracity of these claims is still disputed. Moreover, some of her difficulties were brought upon herself by Mary. She refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of her father's new marriage, and part of the treatment of her during these years was clearly designed to pressure her into making a public statement of support for the new queen. In this environment, a chilly relationship developed between king and daughter in the mid-1530s. In many ways, it was a very familial affair. Mary, who would be 20 before long, was proving to be as hard-headed as her father. Under these conditions, her health worsened further, and she also became more devout, taking comfort from daily prayer. The following 3 years were full of both religious and dynastic upheaval. In March of 1534, the Act of Succession was introduced in Parliament, followed later in the year by the institution of the Oath of Succession, the Act of Supremacy, and the Treason Act. Taken together, these measures delegitimized Henry's marriage to Catherine, legitimized his marriage to Anne, set the seal on Henry's power as head of the Church of England, and decreed that denial of any of this was a treasonable offence and punishable by death. In January 1535, Henry's administration began to accelerate reforms by dissolving England's religious houses and taking them into Crown possession. Henry didn't agree to this out of any movement towards Protestant views. He was persuaded in this direction because it led to an enormous cash windfall for the crown through the fire sale of over 800 religious houses and their estates. Some prominent individuals resisted these revolutionary changes. Among them was the English Lord Chancellor Sir Thomas More, who was executed for treason for his refusal to acknowledge Henry's split with Rome. Mary also refused to acknowledge her father's supremacy over the Church. She would have been encouraged, all the same, by the sudden fall of Anne Boleyn. She suffered 2 miscarriages in quick succession after the birth of Elizabeth, and by November 1535, Henry's attention had already wandered to Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Anne's days as queen were numbered. On the 7th of January 1536, Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, died. Some who hated Anne Boleyn for usurping Catherine's place whispered of poison, but Catherine's health had, in fact, been steadily worsening for several years, and she most likely died of cancer. Mary was forbidden to attend her mother's funeral. Catherine's death was devastating for her. In its aftermath, she began writing to her cousin, Emperor Charles V, continuing the case which her mother had pressed to him from afar for so many years. However, things changed rather dramatically. Only a few months later, Anne was accused of adultery and treason, imprisoned in the Tower, and then executed. With this, the now 20-year-old Mary's fortunes had seemingly changed for the better, and she wrote to her father seeking to reconcile. Here, she asked to be allowed to return to court, to serve Jane Seymour, who Henry had quickly taken as his 3rd queen. Mary, though, received a cold reply from Henry's, by now all-powerful chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, that the king still demanded that Mary submit to him regarding the act of supremacy. Mary wrote desperately to Cromwell that she had, quote, done the utmost that her conscience would suffice. Cromwell replied that if such were the case, then Henry would most likely not allow her to return to court in any fashion. In the end, convinced that she now had no other choice, Mary relented and, on the surface, acknowledged the religious changes that had been carried out in recent time, despite the manner in which they clashed with her ardent Catholicism. Mary's circumstances improved markedly after she returned to court. Henry was happy to welcome her back, and father and daughter gradually reconciled. Henry gave Mary splendid chambers at court, as well as princely accommodations at the country estates of Hunsdon, Beaulieu, and Hatfield. A warm relationship also developed between Mary and her new stepmother, Jane Seymour, who is often credited with helping to restore Henry's 2 daughters to favour. The relationship between Mary and Elizabeth would change too over time. Previously, Mary had not been able to develop much sisterly affection for the half-sister who had replaced her, and the 17-year age gap between them did little to encourage their closeness. But Elizabeth's delegitimization effectively made the 2 sisters equals, both the natural daughters of a king, equally excluded from the line of succession. This likely made it easier for Mary to develop a closer and less complicated relationship with Elizabeth as the latter grew up in the 1540s. All England rejoiced as well on the 12th of October 1537 when Queen Jane gave birth to the long-desired male heir, Prince Edward. Being supplanted by a male heir was much easier for Mary to accept, since it was the accepted convention. The return to something approaching a normal family life was seen in her standing as godmother to Prince Edward. Sadly, though, Jane Seymour died of puerperal fever, then known as childbed fever, within 2 weeks of giving birth to her son. Mary served as chief mourner at her stepmother's funeral.
This video is sponsored by Odoo, an all-in-one management platform offering a suite of apps for all your business needs. Used by 12 million users worldwide to manage their businesses, fully customizable, Odoo increases efficiency, saves time and money, and makes organizing your business a breeze. Odoo provides a range of applications to simplify daily business management, including invoicing, accounting, project management, inventory, website creation, recruitment, and much more. Odoo Recruitment brings together your entire recruitment process so you can find the best talent for your team quickly and easily. Job offers can be published online in just a few clicks, and when candidates apply online, their resumes, covering letters, and other documentation are attached to their record and organized in the documents application. So, to organize your hiring process, Odoo offers a centralized system displaying job offers, candidates, as well as scheduled activities, all clearly laid out on the recruitment dashboard. You can click on a specific job offer to display all applications and the stage they are at, such as receiving applications, hiring, interviews, and tests. You can also click on a particular candidate to change their place in the pipeline or to proceed automatically through the pipeline once certain tasks are completed. Make a candidate a new employee directly from the recruitment app and onboard them easily and efficiently. Be one of the ever-increasing numbers who grow the efficiency of their business with Odoo. Just click the link in the description and start hiring smarter with Odoo, and at a very affordable price, including unlimited hosting and support.
Henry mourned Jane's death deeply and would not marry again for 2 years. By 1539, negotiations were underway for the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a German principality in the Rhineland. Mary was now 23 years old. Her life was considerably happier and more stable than it had been in years. One thing which had not changed, though, was her unmarried state. As the king's daughter, she could not be married to an Englishman below her station, and if a foreign prince were to be the solution, the problem arose of who she should marry in order to cultivate a foreign alliance for England. When Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was being negotiated, a simultaneous offer was made for Mary's hand by Anne's cousin, Duke Philip of Bavaria. In December of 1539, the Duke arrived quietly in England. Mary and Philip met in the gardens at Westminster Abbey, where they got to know each other. Philip soon expressed his eagerness to marry, despite their religious incompatibility, as Philip was a Protestant. Mary indicated her willingness to consider the match if it was what her father wished, but the proposal was foiled by the swift annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. This was contracted on the continent before they ever met, and when Anne finally arrived to England, Henry was not happy with his new wife, claiming the court painter Hans Holbein, who had been sent to Germany to paint a picture of Anne for the king to view back in England, had flattered her in his depiction. Henry immediately sought an annulment to the marriage bonds that had been exchanged between Anne and Henry's representatives in Germany, one which was quickly granted. In tandem, Henry abandoned plans to wed his daughter to Duke Philip. Strangely, Anne continued to live in England afterwards, and she and Mary developed a close enough relationship. In July of 1540, Before the ink was even dry on his annulment, Henry married as his fifth wife Catherine Howard, a 17-year-old niece of the Duke of Norfolk, the senior most noble in England. Mary found it difficult to get along with her fourth stepmother. Catherine was 9 years younger than Mary herself, and their personalities were very different. The new queen was high-spirited, vivacious, and, to Mary's mind, rather immature. Queen Catherine soon began to complain to King Henry that Lady Mary did not show her enough respect, and Mary absented herself from court more frequently. Mary was also somewhat aggrieved, like many others at court, at the manner in which Thomas Cromwell had been swiftly removed from power and executed on Henry's orders after the Cleves alliance collapsed, and the Duke of Norfolk, Cromwell's inveterate enemy in government, engineered the marriage of his niece to the king. While Cromwell had been central to organising Henry's divorce from Mary's mother nearly a decade earlier, Mary and he had developed a friendly relationship in the years that followed, and there were even rumours at the time that Cromwell was scheming to marry Henry's daughter. That plan, if it ever really existed, came to naught, as Cromwell was executed on the 28th of July, 1540. Mary had a great deal more reason to resent her father the following year when Henry reacted to a potential coup with the execution of nearly an entire family of cousins to the Tudors, the Poles. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was the daughter of the long-dead George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, a younger brother of King Edward IV, who had ruled England between 1461 and 1483 in the midst of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret's family was amongst the few descendants of the old House of York that remained after the Wars of the Roses. Each of her 4 sons represented a potential rival claimant to the throne. Moreover, the Poles were fervently Roman Catholic. When the Protestant reforms had advanced to the point of Henry's excommunication from the church, a faction began to form around one scion of the family, Reginald Pole, who was then living in Italy, to raise him to the throne. Pole had been made a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church in 1536. In the period that followed, Henry made every effort to have Cardinal Pole sent back to England. When he failed, the king instead ordered the arrest of his relatives in England. Then, in one of Henry's most disreputable acts, he ordered the execution of the cardinal's 67-year-old mother and 2 of her sons, as well as imprisoning her grandson, who died, most likely of starvation, within a year. Mary was deeply grieved by Lady Salisbury's execution, as Margaret had been Mary's governess for many years in her childhood. The 2 women had remained close in subsequent years. In years to come, Mary would seek to bring the Poles, or what remained of the family, back into the fold in England. In the early 1540s, when all of this occurred, though, she could do little but swallow whatever resentments she felt. Henry ordered the execution of his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, for adultery and treason in February of 1542. Less than a year later, he married his 6th wife, Catherine Parr. Like Jane Seymour before him, Catherine Parr made efforts to be a loving stepmother to all 3 of Henry's children and encouraged a close family environment. While it might have been difficult for Mary to regard Catherine Parr as a maternal figure, since Catherine was only 3 years older than herself, the 2 had known one another for several years and got along well. Both women were highly educated. Catherine is often credited with influencing Henry to restore his daughters fully to the line of succession, for which Mary was deeply grateful. Meanwhile, Henry's declining health over the next years made Mary realize that soon the man that held this strange family together would be gone, and that the differences between herself and her siblings might be harder to reconcile in future. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547. 3 days later, his 9-year-old son from his brief marriage to Jane Seymour was proclaimed as King Edward VI. He was just 9 years old, and so a regency council would rule on his behalf until the boy came of age. Henry was generous to his children in his will. He left vast estates and movable property to both of his daughters and explicitly recognized their places in the succession. If Edward died without an heir, Mary would succeed him first, and lacking any issue herself, the throne would then pass to Elizabeth. Henry also left Mary extensive estates in East Anglia, including lands in the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Mary now headed her own independent household, an extremely rare state for an unmarried woman, even a princess. Henry's children drifted apart from one another after his death. Mary rarely came to court, preferring to live quietly on her estates in East Anglia rather than witness the advance of a radical new Protestant regime, as the Seymour family and others at court, such as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, now began to implement a more thoroughgoing reformation. Henry had been a Catholic in virtually all respects. He had simply tolerated the Protestants in his government as they had facilitated the organization of his divorce back in the 1530s. However, the 1540s had seen a Catholic backlash against the Protestants. Now, they were free to respond in turn, and Cranmer and others were determined to make England a Protestant nation once Edward succeeded to the throne. In 1549, Edward's government passed the Act of Uniformity, which abolished the Latin Mass and introduced the English Book of Common Prayer, compiled by Cranmer, which prescribed a new Protestant church service in English. Catholic processions, pilgrimages, and other ceremonies were prohibited. The Act also called for the removal of all Catholic-style display, and in churches and abbeys across England, stained glass windows were smashed, and crucifixes and religious images were torn down and burnt. From her estates away from court, Mary watched on with some horror at the new attacks on the Roman Catholic Church. She herself flouted the new rules and continued to hear the Mass in Latin, frequently inviting Catholics to join her. It was during this time that Mary's religious devotion began to be remarked upon as extraordinary. She reportedly began attending Mass as many as 4 times daily and spending hours at prayer. At court, Edward and his advisors soon resolved to put a stop to his sister's open practice of Catholicism. He invited his 2 sisters to court for Christmas in 1550 for a rare family reunion. An exceptionally embarrassing episode occurred during the celebrations when the 13-year-old Edward publicly chastised and denounced his 34-year-old sister in front of the whole court for her disobedience in refusing to accept the new religious dispensations. Then, a few weeks later, Mary was summoned to appear at court once again. She arrived with a large retinue, every last one of her attendants visibly carrying rosary beads. When Edward once again called upon her to submit, she invoked the protection of her cousin, Emperor Charles V. The Spanish ambassador then stepped forward and threatened Edward with diplomatic consequences should Lady Mary not be permitted to practice her religion freely. Edward was enraged, yet he backed down all the same, grudgingly agreeing to allow Mary to continue to hear the Latin Mass, though only in private. Mary had scored a great victory, not just for herself, but for Catholics across England who were encouraged and emboldened by her resistance. It is important to remember when assessing these events and what would happen throughout the 1550s that Roman Catholics were still very much in the majority in England and Wales. The Protestants might have come to power in London and at court, but they probably accounted for no more than 10 to 20% of the population during Edward's reign. Hence, Mary became a symbol of Catholic resistance within the royal family for many people. The struggle with her brother no doubt called up terrible memories of similar conflicts with her father, and Mary began to be afraid that she might have gone too far. Fearful that Edward might now seize upon any excuse to imprison her, Mary began plotting in 1551 to flee from England to the continent by enlisting the aid of her cousin, Emperor Charles V, through the Spanish ambassador in London. She came very close to doing so late that summer, though eventually she decided against it and resolved to remain in England. It would prove before long to have been a very wise decision. Contrary to the traditional historical characterizations of him, King Edward VI was not the weak and sickly boy he has often been portrayed to be. He was actually a strong, healthy, and athletic boy, much like his father had been as a young man. No one, therefore, had any serious expectation that the boy would not grow up. However, during the autumn of 1552, he suffered, in quick succession, an attack of measles and then one of smallpox. These illnesses were catastrophic to his immune system, and Edward subsequently became perilously weak and sick. Fearing that he might die and leave the English throne to his Catholic sister, Edward agreed to a new plan for the royal succession. This nullified the last wishes of his father and formally excluded both of his sisters from the succession. He observed that his sisters were both illegitimate and should not inherit the crown, before stating that if he died without issue, he should be succeeded by the 15-year-old Lady Jane Grey, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's youngest sister, Mary. At the same time, Edward's condition worsened in the spring and early summer of 1553. He had begun to cough up blood, and many historians believe that he was now suffering from tuberculosis, though it may have been a combination of conditions. Knowing that his time was short, Edward made plans to summon his sisters to court and sanctioned John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, real power behind the throne, who had plotted to make Lady Grey the new heir, to capture and imprison them both when they arrived. The goal was to ensure that Grey would be proclaimed queen without opposition. Mary received Edward's summons on the 2nd of July 1553. She was aware that he had been ill, but believed he was recovering. Therefore, When she received his summons, she was not worried and departed for London with several retainers the following day. Mary and her retinue only got as far as Hertfordshire when they were intercepted on the road by a supporter of Mary's from court. He had ridden hard to warn her of the trap her brother had set for her and informed her that Edward was dying and was planning to place the Protestant Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Mary immediately turned around and rushed back to East Anglia. Retreating to Framlingham Castle, she began to mobilize her many supporters there. She did not have long to prepare. On the 6th of July 1553, 15-year-old Edward died at Greenwich Palace, and Lady Jane Grey was quickly proclaimed as Queen of England by the Duke of Northumberland. However, she was never crowned, as within days the national tide shifted overwhelmingly in Mary's favour. The Privy Council, seeing that Edward's plan for the succession was proving to be wildly unpopular, transferred their support to Mary and proclaimed her queen on the 19th of July. Mary rode into London on a wave of support, while the unfortunate Jane Grey, who was nothing more than a pawn in these machinations, was placed in the Tower of London and eventually executed in early 1554. The Duke of Northumberland was placed on trial, found guilty of treason, and executed just a month after Mary ascended as queen. Mary's accession to the throne was greeted with a sense of both continuity and relief to many who had feared the excesses of her brother's religious reforms. Protestants, on the other hand, fearing the religious upheaval to come, began to leave England for exile. Most historians identify Mary's major objectives as queen as being the restoration of the Catholic faith in England, something which could be secured in the long run by her marriage, even in her late 30s, and the production of a Catholic heir. These were certainly cherished goals of hers, but they were certainly not the only ones. In her mind, and according to conventional wisdom, they were foremost because nothing else could be achieved in any lasting way without them. Without an heir, she could have no stability, and therefore could not ensure that any reforms she might enact would endure for decades to come. The new queen needed allies to work closely with her in her new government, and soon brought figures like Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who had been marginalized and persecuted under Edward, into her government. Gardiner was made Bishop of Winchester and Lord Chancellor, and it was he who placed the crown on Mary's head at her coronation in Westminster Abbey on the 1st of October 1553. Other initial measures concerned the treasury. Mary came to the throne when it was in a bleak state financially. Her father's spendthrift habits in the last decade of his reign and enormously costly wars with France had brought the country close to bankruptcy. Currency debasement had followed. Edward VI had been forced to continue debasement of the coinage to maintain his own government, and by the time of his death, English coins were largely just copper coated in silver. Mary decided on a two-pronged strategy to resolve the fiscal problem: a budgetary retrenchment in key departments and a reorganization and streamlining of the tax system. It would take years, and Mary would not live to see better days for the English economy, but she laid the groundwork for an economic recovery in England in the second half of the 16th century. Mary was indeed her mother's daughter and comprehended a nation's might in much the same way as her Spanish royal forebears did. As such, she was keen to promote the development of navigation and exploration, particularly in pursuit of a northeast passage, a sea route over the north of Europe to Asia. To this end, Mary issued a charter to the Muscovy Company in 1555, the first joint stock company in English history, under the governorship of famed explorer Sebastian Cabot, giving them a trading monopoly in Russia and the Baltic region. She patronized cartographers and navigators to produce maps and atlases, and sponsored naval adventurers to sail south to establish trade relationships with the west coast of Africa. The Muscovy Company soon established contacts with the Duchy of Muscovy in Russia and began trading therewith, an important early development in England's overseas colonial and commercial activity. As the first real Queen Regnant of England, Mary was in unfamiliar territory. The best course seemed to be to go with conventional wisdom and find a husband with whom she could produce an heir. This was problematic in and of itself. Most Englishmen occupied a station too low to wed the Queen, and the few eligible English Catholic nobles proved unsuitable. Mary's cousin, Charles V, proposed marriage to his only son, Prince Philip of Spain. A portrait of Prince Philip, painted by the great Italian painter Titian, was sent to Mary in late 1553. Mary was said to have instantly fallen in love with the young man in the portrait. This anecdote, if true, reveals a part of Mary's personality that hitherto she had been forced to keep hidden, her ardent desire to finally marry and start a family, after literally decades of turmoil in which the subject of her marrying had become enormously complicated. Now, finally, Mary was queen and could pursue marriage on her own terms. Thus, at the age of 37, she insisted on marrying the handsome Prince Philip of Spain, who was 11 years younger than herself at the time. Mary's choice of husband was very unpopular. Most English people were deeply suspicious of foreigners and feared that the ever-expanding Spanish state, which controlled the Low Countries and much of Italy and Europe, and had an empire that spanned huge parts of the Americas, would absorb England politically. Indeed, Mary's determination to wed the Spanish prince sparked a rebellion in January 1554. This originated in Kent and was led by Sir Thomas Wyatt. During it, 3,000 rebels marched towards London with the intention of deposing Mary and possibly placing Mary's younger sister, Elizabeth, on the throne, though Elizabeth was not directly involved in the revolt. Mary had fewer loyal supporters in the capital than elsewhere in England and was forced to act quickly to persuade London to act on her behalf. The Queen stood up before restive crowds at London's Guildhall on the 1st of February 1554 and gave a rousing speech to galvanise support for her. Thereafter, London's people acted decisively to bar the city gates to the rebels. Mary's subsequent response was severe. Wyatt and many of the other leaders of the revolt were executed. Elizabeth, who insisted that she had not been involved in the plot, was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower for several months, but she was eventually released. This whole episode made Mary even more determined to marry Philip, though a Marriage Act was issued by Parliament in April 1554, through which it was stated that while Prince Philip would bear the title King of England, he would remain the more junior figure in their marriage so far as English law went. Moreover, if Mary were to predecease Philip without their marriage having resulted in children, Philip would have no claim to the throne, which would instead pass to Elizabeth. Mary finally met Philip for the first time at Hampton Court Palace on the 23rd of July 1554. She was strongly attracted to him, telling him that she looked forward eagerly to their marriage. One of Philip's aides confided to a correspondent that Philip did not find the now 37-year-old Mary attractive at all, but obeyed his father's command to marry the Queen of England for dynastic reasons and for the influence Spain might now be able to exercise in England. The two were married at Winchester Cathedral 2 days later on the 25th of July 1554. The wedding emphasized Mary's commitment to simplicity and tradition. Rather than the fabulous display typical of royal weddings, Mary's was rather simple. Her love of fine fashion was evident, with the bride in a gown of purple and gold tissue, but she wore a plain gold wedding band. This period immediately after her marriage was a happy one for Mary. Little more than a month later, she began to show signs of pregnancy, experiencing morning sickness and gaining weight. In the midst of this, on the 24th of November 1554, Mary received her cousin, Cardinal Reginald Pole, at court. After his long exile in Italy, he had arrived home to England as the official papal envoy, one who would help begin the process of restoring England to the Roman Church. Cardinal Pole greeted the Queen by quoting the Ave Maria. In the Christian scriptures, the angel Gabriel salutes the Virgin Mary with this prayer when delivering the news that she is pregnant with the Christ child. Mary later reported that as she listened to Cardinal Pole speak, she could feel her baby stirring in her womb. In early modern Europe, even if a woman showed symptoms of pregnancy, she was not considered officially pregnant until she felt a quickening. That is, until she felt the baby move inside her. England rejoiced at news this had occurred, and Parliament promptly passed an act designating Philip as regent for Mary's heir should she die in childbirth and the baby survive. In April of 1555, Mary withdrew from the court for her confinement about 6 weeks before her anticipated due date, as was the tradition. Mary's sister Elizabeth was summoned to court to attend her sister, along with numerous ladies and midwives. The birthing chamber was an extremely rarefied atmosphere, a world of women not to be seen by public eyes. Still, Mary could not resist flaunting her joy, and on St. George's Day, soon after she entered her confinement, Mary quite deliberately appeared at a window to watch her husband lead the festivities, standing in a side profile so that the crowd could see her big belly. England waited with bated breath for the child who would inherit one of the greatest royal legacies in European history, both the throne of England and the Spanish Habsburg Empire. On the 1st of June, Mary complained of pain and cramping, and the midwives and court physicians predicted the birth would occur within days. But these came and went, and still no baby was born. the summer stretched on, and Mary's attendants became more uneasy. As the summer passed, and still no child was born, more and more people began to doubt the Queen's pregnancy, and rumours swirled around London. By late July, Mary's belly had begun to recede. There would be no baby. It had been a phantom pregnancy, a very rare condition in which a woman physically manifests all the symptoms of pregnancy, yet is not pregnant. It is usually caused by a combination of both hormonal and psychological factors. In this case, Mary was most likely experiencing serious health issues which caused symptoms that were then interpreted as pregnancy. From there, her great desire for a child convinced her that she was, in fact, pregnant. On the 1st of August 1555, Mary quietly exited her confinement and returned to court. Philip was deeply disappointed that no child had been born and, much to Mary's grief, he departed England soon after to manage his affairs on the continent. Abandoned by her husband and humiliated in the eyes of her people, Mary grew despondent, lapsing into depression. The possibility cannot be denied that her despair and precarious mental state might have influenced her subsequent decisions and policies. Mary was heard to blame her misfortunes on the judgment of God for her toleration and mercy towards the Protestant heretics. It is perhaps no accident, then, that the religious persecutions under Mary's government accelerated from the summer of 1555 onwards, though some of this can also be attributed to the influence of Pole and others within the government. The crackdown on the Protestant reforms of her brother's reign intensified in 1555 and 1556. The Protestant measures of the 1530s and 1540s were revoked. Mary retroactively declared her parents' marriage to have been valid after all. She also revoked the 1549 Act of Uniformity and ordered that the Mass be once again celebrated in Latin and churches redecorated in the Catholic manner. Monasticism was revived, clerical celibacy was re-established, and married clerics were removed from their offices and ordered to leave their wives. Roman Catholicism was restored after what many would have perceived as the temporary Protestant aberration of Edward's reign. This satisfied most English people, but more conservative Catholics still wanted to abolish the royal supremacy and return to the fold of the Roman Catholic Church. Mary had not changed her views on the papal supremacy. The rapprochement with Rome was a delicate negotiation which would take many months to complete, and because she needed their support, the settlement allowed Mary's wealthiest and most powerful subjects, who had benefited from Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, to keep the land and the abbeys that had been taken from the church. Philip insisted on going further, and Mary agreed that the old heresy laws should be re-established. Accordingly, in February 1555, as Mary eagerly anticipated her first child, the first executions of Protestants by burning at the stake, for which Mary would become known above all else, were carried out. When the heresy laws were reintroduced, the slow trickle of Protestant exiles from England to places like Protestant Geneva on the continent, which had begun when Mary assumed the throne, swelled. By 1558, over 800 Protestants had left England, and before Mary's reign was over, approximately 280 would be executed in England, mostly by the hideous method of burning at the stake, a punishment which was reserved for heresy at the time. The first executions took place in February of 1555 and were largely made up of Protestant leaders and clergy, but following Mary's false pregnancy and humiliation later that year, they accelerated. Executions for heresy had occurred with some general regularity during her father's reign, but the scale of them in the mid-1550s was unprecedented. While they shocked the English Protestant community, it should not be assumed that Roman Catholics were appalled. Most would have turned out to Smithfield in London to watch the burnings, convinced that they were seeing the end of heretics who deserved their fiery damnation. Mary's decisions in ordering the burnings were popular at the time, as were most of her other religious policies. Had she lived longer, she would almost certainly have returned England, where the population was still largely Catholic, to the Roman Catholic fold and stopped the spread of Protestantism there. That she has been remembered instead as Bloody Mary is in large part owing to the propagandists of the subsequent reign of Elizabeth, and above all, one text, John Foxe's Acts and Monuments, more popularly known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs. Besides the Bible, this book became, for a time in the early modern era, the most widely read book in the English language, setting the seal on Mary's historical reputation as a zealot and a butcher. In it, the persecution of the Protestants killed during Mary's reign was described at length. The illustrations which accompanied the text depicted the burnings. Probably the most famous Marian martyr documented by Foxe was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer had been imprisoned as soon as Mary ascended the throne. At trial, he had caved in and renounced his Protestantism. Typically, it was the practice to spare the lives of repentant heretics if they recanted their previous beliefs in public. Mary, however, was feeling vengeful when it came to Cranmer, a figure who was central to her mother's divorce from Henry, and insisted that he would die. The plan backfired. When Cranmer was paraded out on the 21st of March 1556, he found his courage and abandoned his plans to offer a further recantation in the hope that he would be spared. Instead, in a speech he disavowed his earlier recantation, reaffirmed his Protestant faith, and denounced the Pope as the Antichrist. He was then roughly pulled down from the platform and taken to the scaffold, where he was committed to the flames. Cranmer died what Foxe would later describe as a magnificent martyr's death. As the flames were ignited before him, the former archbishop thrust his right hand into the flames to burn it first, for the sin of signing the recantation of his Protestant faith. As Foxe recounted in the Book of Martyrs, his last words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. I see the heavens open and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." Eventually, there was some turning of public opinion against the execution of Cranmer and the other Protestant martyrs. This, combined with ongoing harvest failures, her false pregnancy, and her husband's abandonment of her, tarnished Mary's image by 1557 and 1558. These issues were compounded by war. In March of 1557, Philip, who had succeeded his own father as King of Spain, returned to England to convince Mary that England should provide troops to support the Spanish in their most recent war with the French. Initially, things went well, with a major joint Spanish and English victory against the French at the Battle of Saint-Quentin in northern France in August 1557. But things took a catastrophic turn in January 1558 when the French seized control of Calais, the last English stronghold on the continent, and the French port from which many English people had assumed England would one day begin to conquer parts of France yet again, as they had in the glory days of King Edward III and King Henry V during the 100 Years' War. This loss was the final blow to Mary's image as Queen. Furthermore, the fact that the Pope was allied with the King of France against Philip strained England's relationship with Catholic Rome, impeding Mary's goals of a full return to the Roman Catholic fold. Some months after Philip had returned to Spain in July 1557, Mary believed that she was pregnant once again. As the months wore on, though, Mary's abdomen initially swelled, but then her appetite disappeared as she grew thinner and weaker. Most suspected that she was terribly ill rather than pregnant. By the spring of 1558, many were already preparing for the succession of her half-sister Elizabeth. By the autumn, Mary began preparing some last wishes. She endowed monastic and educational institutions with bequests and scholarships, and instructed that daily masses should be said for her soul and for those of her parents. She also requested that her mother, Catherine of Aragon, be exhumed from her grave at Peterborough Cathedral so that mother and daughter might be buried together at Westminster Abbey. This last request was never carried out. Historians believe that it was ovarian or uterine cancer that claimed Mary's life on the 17th of November 1558 at 42 years of age. She had probably been living with it for years, as it would explain her earlier phantom pregnancy. Mary was buried in Westminster Abbey in a modest tomb, one which would become much more elaborate when Elizabeth, 45 years later, was buried next to her. Inscribed above their resting place is a Latin inscription which, translated, reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb, we sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, here lie down to sleep, in hope of the resurrection." One was a Catholic, one was a Protestant. There would be no repeat of the chaos of Lady Jane Grey's revolt in 1553 when Mary died in November 1558. A smooth succession occurred with Elizabeth, the last of Henry VIII's children from any of his marriages, succeeding her half-sister. The daughter of Anne Boleyn was a moderate Protestant, one who liked the ostentation and trappings of Roman Catholicism, but skewed doctrinally towards Lutheranism. Thus, a moderate form of Protestantism was reimposed from 1558 onwards, and the Protestant exiles on the continent began to make their way home to England. Elizabeth's reign lasted 45 years, and it was this longevity more than anything else which ensured the success of the Protestant Reformation after decades of shifts back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, a majority of English men and women had been born after 1558 and had grown up in the Anglican Protestant faith. Mary's efforts to restore England to the Catholic fold were a failure as a result in the long run, and her reputation was systematically torn apart by Fox and others through the books they published from the late 1550s onwards. Mary Tudor is generally deemed to have been one of the most controversial of all England's monarchs. The legend of Bloody Mary is that England was drifting benignly towards Protestantism in the 16th century when she came to the throne and inflicted a 5-year reign of terror on her subjects in her quest to reimpose Roman Catholicism. The reality is that England was still broadly Roman Catholic in 1553, and Mary simply engaged in a campaign to reverse what were perceived by many English people at the time as religious aberrations inflicted on England by her father and, in particular, her half-brother. It is also not as though she was alone in doing this. While they occurred over a longer time frame, over 200 heretics were killed in England during the reign of her half-sister, while revolts which had religious overtones during the reigns of both Henry VIII and Edward VI, such as the Pilgrimage of Grace in the 1530s and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk in 1549, resulted in hundreds of deaths. The Northern Rising of 1569 was a Roman Catholic revolt in the north of England, which was suppressed, following which at least 700 Catholic insurrectionists were executed through martial law by Elizabeth's government. If Mary was particularly bloody on account of her religion, so too were her father, half-brother and half-sister. That Mary has been remembered in the fashion that she has been shows how effectively John Fox did his job in writing his Book of Martyrs. Other than this, we might say of Mary that she was a woman who had a very difficult life owing to her father's actions in the late 1520s and throughout the 1530s, continued to experience difficulties during the reign of her Protestant half-brother, and responded, when she became queen, by doubling down on her own Catholic convictions, initiating a campaign of repression against the burgeoning Protestant Church in England. Ultimately, she was a typical monarch of Europe during the brutality that was the wars of religion, unleashed by the Protestant Reformation. What do you think of Queen Mary I? Does she deserve her reputation as Bloody Mary, the vicious burner of heretics? Or is her poor reputation simply a sign of the success of subsequent Protestant propagandists like John Fox, who unfairly condemned a queen who was popular in her own time? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.